Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. It's Rob Ford. Happy to be with you again. We have a great show coming up. In a little bit, going to be airing an interview with U.S. Congressman Kelly Armstrong, who has some interesting things to say about transitioning into office as a freshman congressman with the government shutdown. Also, he made some headlines for a tweet he made at Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has been something of a media darling of late. He was pretty critical in that tweet, but he explains why he sent that tweet, and also describes an interesting conversation he had with the Congresswoman on a bus ride. They talked for 15 minutes, proving, maybe that even people on opposite ends of the political spectrum can find some common ground and some ways to get along. But before we get into that interview, I want to rant at you a little bit about some things. It's from sayanythingblog.com, which is North Dakota's most popular political blog, which, in addition to listening to this podcast, you should be reading every day, I think, anyway, if I could be a little bit self-serving for a moment. First and foremost, a lot of people have been flipping out about this Gillette ad. It's an ad from Gillette, and I don't know. I don't think much about Gillette these days. I don't buy my razors from Gillette anymore. I think they're hugely overpriced. I'm not a fan of their products to begin with. That being said, they put an ad out, and the ad is tied to a campaign. It's called "The Best Men Can Be." And basically, I think a lot of people, the criticism I'm hearing of the ad, a lot of people are saying, well, it's unfair to men. It takes aim at toxic masculinity. Oh, it's this terrible, terrible thing. I watched the ad, and I don't really have a problem with the ad. Now, I say that most types of corporate virtue signaling is obnoxious. I can't think of an example where a corporation decided to lecture me about some social issue or what have you that I came away with a positive feeling. I think it's all obnoxious. I think it's even hypocritical for Gillette to go down this road, given that I seem to remember growing up to Gillette ads showing like sexy models, stroking a man's shaved face. I mean, come on. They've been using sex to sell razor blades for a long time. Now they're going to lecture us about toxic masculinity. Come on. But just going to the ad itself, if you haven't seen it, I'm sure you can find the video on the internet. I put some up at sayanythingblog.com if you want to check it out. But I don't know. I watch the ad, and I just take away from it, the ad's just kind of telling men to be nicer. Right? Don't bully people. Don't beat people up. Don't be demeaning to women. Don't be dismissive of women. I don't know. I watched. There wasn't a message in there that I disagreed with. Just on that front. Like, I don't understand why we're getting upset, why we're, up in arms over a message that just tells people to be nicer to each other. Now, if you want to argue that it's only men that should get this message, well, then I'm going to disagree with you. Women can be jerks, too. Maybe we need to also have an ad telling women not to bully, too. Not to be jerks, too. I do think sometimes we go a little overboard in society today in being critical of men. And, making it seem like it's toxic masculinity or it's just men that's the problem, and I don't agree with that. But just, I don't know that we can blame this ad for that. This ad it's a men's product. It's got a message for men, and I don't necessarily disagree with the message. I don't see what the big deal is. Love to hear what you think. You can certainly email, by the way, anytime on this show if you want to send me feedback. Rob at sayanythingblog.com. Always happy to get that. That was just one thing that I noticed. Another thing that I think is interesting is the government shutdown. Now, I talked a lot about the government shutdown. I've been writing about it on the blog. I talked about it in an earlier podcast episode. And, I talked about why I think the government shut down. I wanted to add a little bit to that because I've got some feedback on that from people saying, well, what about these government workers who are being forced to work without a paycheck? And I agree with that. And in fact, you'll hear in the interview a little bit later in the show, I asked the congressman about that as well. I don't understand how we can go about making federal employees work without paying them. I mean, it's one thing to furlough workers, right? It's one thing to say the government shut down, the government's not going to be providing these services for a while, the employees who provide them are going to stay at home, and they're not going to be paid. That's not great. It's a little embarrassing that we can't keep our government open, But I understand the necessity of saying that in this time and place, we're not going to have these workers come in. I get that. And then also, it's not great for those workers, but they're not being asked. The problem I have are like the air traffic controllers or the TSA agents or the border guards who are being asked to continue to do their jobs. They're being asked to continue to provide a service to the federal government, provide a service to the taxpayers of America, and they're not getting paid. And as a matter of fact, today, as I record this podcast, might be yesterday by the time you get around to listening to it, a federal judge refused to intervene. He was asked to intervene with a lawsuit from federal workers. I think they're federal worker unions. He refused to intervene and get in between a battle between the executive branch and the legislative branches. Maybe that makes sense. But I think when Congress comes back after this shutdown, something that they ought to do is they ought to pass a law and make it so that if we're going to require federal workers to work, we got to pay them. And maybe that puts some more impetus. Maybe that makes it harder for Congress to shut down the government. Maybe it's harder to make maybe it's harder for them to then use the government shutdown as a political weapon if we got to pay the workers who work. Like, we've really got to pay them. Like, we can't just shut down the government and then everything runs on unpaid labor. That's not good. And, oh, by the way, for those of you who are saying, well, all the workers are going to get paid after the shutdown, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. If you ran your business that way, right, if you said, well, I can't balance the budgets and I'm in a dispute with my accounting agency, and in the meantime, I'm not going to pay my workers, but also I'm going to expect them to show up and work, I have a feeling the government would have some things to say to you about that, running your private business that way. But for some reason, the government gets away with it. I don't understand that at all. Another issue that I wanted to talk about as well comes from the North Dakota legislature. We have legislation now that would raise North Dakota's tobacco age to 19. I'm not saying the smoking age. I'm saying the tobacco age. And when I say the tobacco age, I'm also talking about vaping, even though vaping isn't really specifically tobacco use anymore. It might more accurately be described as nicotine use. But the legislation, which was introduced by State Representative Pamela Anderson, a Democrat from Fargo. It's House Bill 1236, if you want to go look it up for yourself. It would make it illegal to sell tobacco, electronic smoking devices, or alternative nicotine products to an individual under the age of 19 years. Now, what's interesting about this, though, and not only can you sell it, also they can't use if they're under the age of 19. What's interesting about this, though, is that there's an exemption. Now, a lot of times when we have this debate about raising the tobacco age, a rebuttal to the proposal to raise the tobacco age is that if somebody is old enough to serve in the military, if they're old enough to fight and die for their country, then why in the world can't they be old enough to make a decision about tobacco? Now, I think that's a compelling argument. If you're an adult, you're an adult. If you can make those sorts of decisions, why can't you make a decision about smoking, however you or I might personally feel about smoking? Well, what this legislation does is it actually creates an exemption for active duty members of the military. It says, I quote, "It is an infraction for any person to sell or furnish to an individual under the age of 19 or procure for an individual under the age of 19 cigarettes, cigarette paper, cigars, snuff, tobacco in any form in which it may be utilized for smoking or chewing, electronic smoking devices, or alternative nicotine products, unless the individual is 18 years of age, is an active duty member of the armed forces, and has a valid military identification card." So essentially what they're trying to do is neutralize that argument against raising the tobacco age by taking it out and saying, well, military members can smoke if they're 18 years of age. Now, I understand the politics behind doing that, but it seems ridiculous to me to carve out an exemption in the criminal code, by the way, for people who are military members. We're like saying it's a crime unless you're an active duty member of the military, and then it's not a crime anymore. That's silly. And by the way, when we make that argument about if you're old enough to serve in the military, you're old enough to smoke, the larger argument is if you're an adult. And being an adult, choosing to serve in the military is just one of the things you can do as an adult. You can do a lot of other things. You can enter into contracts. You can you can make a lot of decisions as an adult that you can't as a child. Among them should be smoking. I don't like this sort of staggered thing we're creating in the law where we have different ages for different things. I don't like it. Either you're an adult or you're not an adult at 18. Either you're allowed to make decisions at 18 or you're not. Now, if we need to raise the age of majority, all right, let's have that debate. But doing this for smoking is silly. And by the way, I think we have more. I don't know that the smoking age really stops anybody from smoking all that much. It seems to me, my experience when I was younger, and certainly it seems true today, even though smoking rates have declined, it seems to me that kids who want to smoke or vape or what have you, they find a way to get that stuff. Whether it's an older brother or an uncle or they're shoplifting or whatever, they get the stuff. And I'm not condoning it. I'm not saying that that's okay. I'm just saying that the age ban doesn't really have much of an impact. And if we want to have a greater impact, I think we're better off, instead of, spending our resources trying to enforce laws like this one, we'd be better off spending our resources trying to inspire people not to want to choose smoking, not to want to choose tobacco products, and going that way. Anyway, all those posts available on sayanythingblog.com if you want to check them out. We'll now go to our interview with Congressman Kelly Armstrong next here on the Plain Talk Podcast. United States Congressman Kelly Armstrong is on air with me. And Kelly, I imagine you've had a little bit of a unique experience entering the United States House of Representatives as a freshman, in that you came into office and the government was shut down. And I was talking with somebody earlier today, and I told them I was going to be interviewing you, and they said, well, has he been able to get his email password or anything with the government shut down? I mean, what's that been like to transition into office with the government shut down?
Well, first, I think it's important to recognize that 25% of the government is shut down. But no, it has posed some challenges. Our offices in Fargo and D.C. are up and running. We're moving into the federal building in Bismarck, so that has been definitely slowed up by the shutdown. And so we just are. I mean, it's unique in and of itself that we're switching from the majority to the minority and walking in the middle of all of this. So some things are working slower than they would normally, but we're getting up and running and moving forward.
Well, that's good to hear. What do you think of the shutdown overall? I mean, obviously this whole thing got started before you actually took office, so you're coming in here a little bit. I don't want to say behind the eight ball, but I mean this wasn't really, you weren't very involved in this. You just took office, but how are we going to get to a point where we can get this government back open again and back to business?
Well, I think parties need to negotiate in good faith. We're in divided government, whether everybody likes it. And this is the Democratic side, Republican side, both sides. Whether we like that or not, that is the case. The answer can simply not be from Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats. No, we're going to pass bills that have no chance of being taken up in the Senate or being signed by the president. And they need to get into a room. They need to negotiate in good faith, both on border security and opening up the government again.
What do you, I mean, obviously President Trump, his sticking point on this is he wants funding for his border wall. Democrats don't want to give it up. That's the big sticking point. I'm sure there's other issues as well that would need to be resolved. But from everybody on the outside looking in, that's the big one. Do you think President Trump's right to stick to his guns on the border wall?
I do, and the reason I do is because if they do it in any different shape or form, I think it's obvious that there will never be a good faith discussion about it at any other time. And border security is, this is a crisis that's been building for 20 years. There's a lot of numbers that get thrown around, Rob, but the number that I've been using, because I think it's the easiest one to deal with, and then you don't get bogged down in it, is 400,000 illegals. And that's the lowest number in the last 20 years that are crossing the border. So the fact that we have managed not to do anything about it for such a long time does not mean that we can't do something about it now.
I agree, although it seems like we do need to do something comprehensive. And I hate saying comprehensive immigration reform because it seems like we've been throwing that term around for about as long as I've been writing about politics, decades now. Oh, we need comprehensive immigration reform. But I'll tell you, sometimes, Kelly, it seems like the solution's simple. Why not have easy legal immigration and no quarter for illegal immigration? Why is this so hard?
Hey, I just yesterday I agreed to sign on to a letter to expand our work visa program. North Dakota has 30,000 open jobs, skilled and unskilled, nurses, tech, construction, all the way across the board. And I've said this in the campaign. And one, you know this, my wife is from Oslo, Norway. Nobody loves legal immigration more than I do. But we need to have this conversation because we need to be able to have a workforce to drive our economy, and we can't even have those conversations because it gets bogged down in the toxic part of border security and illegal drug flow and illegal immigration and illegal human trafficking. And there are real immigration issues that are affecting people in North Dakota right now.
If you had, what would you like to see? I mean, obviously, eventually, if we get to a point where, the Democratic leadership and President Trump can come eye to eye on some issues. I mean, what are you willing to vote for in terms of a compromise? What's the bare minimum that you're willing to go to get this done?
Yeah, I mean, a real significant increase in border security funding. And also, I personally, I mean, I don't always agree with Lindsey Graham, but I tend to agree with him a little bit on this point. Now, if everybody would, use this as an opportunity, we could probably solve some big, long-ranging issues, or at least begin to solve them. So, I mean, the answer is the bare minimum, I think, is what's going to be taken up in the Senate and what the president's willing to sign to get the government back open and secure our border.
One thing that's been interesting to watch, and I want to say that it's ironic, although it's hard to laugh at this situation because honestly, it's embarrassing. I mean, it's embarrassing that our government has reached this point, that we're in this position, and we can't even do this right. That's an embarrassing thing in my mind. But it's been ironic that Federal Border Patrol is working without pay during the government shutdown. A lot of federal workers are working without pay. TSA agents and air traffic control people are working without pay during the government shutdown. Do you think that's right? I mean, if these workers are important enough to say, well, you got to continue working, is it right that we're not paying them, Kelly? That seems, beyond all the politics of this, that just seems like a decency issue.
Yeah, and the one that, I mean, obviously we're from North Dakota. You can't pick a more landlocked place than North Dakota. But the Coast Guard is the one that really kind of really bothers me. It's not that the other ones don't as well, but they are out there doing an essential function. They can't call in sick. They are part of our national security, and they are out there serving their country without getting paid right now. So that's the one that, of all of them, that's the one that bothers me the most. But yeah, we should figure out a way to make that happen.
Now, Kelly, what's been your biggest surprise since coming into Congress? I mean, obviously you've had a lot of years working in politics. You're familiar with a lot of the ins and outs, but transitioning into office, it's a new experience. What surprised you about it?
The biggest surprise I have had, and I truly mean this, and this isn't partisan either, this is on both sides, is how generous current members of Congress are with their time and how they want you to succeed as a congressman. And even in this, part of this, somebody told me today, 80% of what we pass off of the House floor is off what's called the consent agenda, which means it has to have 2/3 vote. There's still a lot of bipartisan work getting done. It seems we've gotten to such a toxic political environment. Nobody wants to talk about it. But really, truly, what's been surprising is how, and I don't know why this surprises me, but it just did, is how willing people are to help you figure out how to do this job well.
Talking about that environment and talking about partisanship, you got some, well, I guess both some applause and some jabs. You took aim at one of your new colleagues, a Democratic Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I don't even know if I'm saying that right. Ocasio-Cortez. I think I'm getting that right. You took some jabs at her on Twitter. What occasioned that? What made you want to write that?
Yeah, I typically don't engage in that kind of stuff all the time, but that one just really kind of struck a nerve with me because reading the Washington Post that morning, the first thing in the Washington Post was essentially that she needs to get her facts right. And the first thing that I heard out of her mouth when she was on TV after the president's speech was he needs to get his facts straight. And, I think I also said in the interview, it doesn't always get as much play when you deal with political hypocrisy if you do it on your own side. I also made a mention to Mitt Romney and doing the same thing when he needed President Trump. He's sure sitting there and all smiles, and as soon as he got elected, then he managed to come up quite critical of him. And so I don't like hypocrisy. I don't like political hypocrisy. It was nothing personal. I sat and talked to her for 15 minutes on the bus during orientation. We had a very good discussion about the difference between representing an at-large state and a state. I mean, my biggest trouble is getting from Grand Forks to Dickinson in a day. Her biggest trouble in her district is getting into an apartment building. So we had a great conversation. She's incredibly nice. She's very charismatic. She quotes The Watchmen, which I think is cool because I'm a comic book nerd. But I just said something about her political hypocrisy, and I mean, it was pretty front and center to me, and I don't like it. I don't like it when we do it. I don't like it when they do it.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, 15 minutes on the bus. Did you talk about the tweet? I mean, what else did you guys talk about?
No, this was when we were down here for orientation. We really did. It was a very interesting conversation about how big her district was compared to how big our district was, and and the different challenges you face in representing an urban district that's not very large versus being an at-large representative representing a whole state. So I hope people continue to do that and know that about me. I will say things about people's politics, but I don't ever expect that. I don't want them to take it personally, and I'll try not to, attack them personally. And I think we make mistakes when we do that to her or anybody else. I mean, the policies she promotes are not good for North Dakota, and I'm completely comfortable saying that. But I'm never going to go after her as a person or anybody else as a person.
Well, and I think there's even something to be said, because your tweet was about her politics, and you didn't say it about her on like a cable news show or a podcast or something, or you didn't write it about her in a blog post. You talk to her. You talk directly to her. And I think that's the problem. Isn't that we disagree on policies. Americans have disagreed with one another for as long as America has been America. And before that, even. I mean, we disagree, and that's okay. I think the problem a lot of times, Kelly, is we just talk past each other rather than we talk about each other rather than talking to each other. And honestly, I think maybe we ought to do more of the latter, even though it's hard. And even though sometimes it makes you mad, I think we're better off talking to each other.
I agree with that, and I've told some people that I think probably my years as a criminal defense attorney prepares me more for this, or for being out here in the minority, than necessarily all the political experience I have. And the reason I say that is when you practice trial law in small towns all across the state of North Dakota, you are going to get into some heated arguments, whether it's with law enforcement, prosecutors, judges. And if you take that personally, you're not going to enjoy going to work very much every day. So I managed to do that in my professional career, and managed to still maintain very good relationships and very close friendships with people who I don't always agree with.
Now, tell me, you've come into office. Obviously, the government shutdown, that's the big thing on everybody's mind. We're trying to negotiate a package to get the government back on. But what's your legislative agenda for this first year in office? I mean, what are your big policy areas that you're focused on?
Yeah, I think one of the things we really need to continue to work on, and I think it's important for North Dakota, and it's actually something we can continue to do in a divided government, is continue to work with the federal regulators to continue to give back more control to the states and to have a less adversarial regulatory environment than we have experienced in some of our biggest industries over the last 10, 12 years. So that's something I'll continue to work on every day. And then, find things that we can work on. Last legislative session in North Dakota, we passed significant criminal justice reform. At the end of last year, the federal government passed opioid legislation and criminal justice legislation, and I think those were fantastic first steps. But as well as anyone that when you pass big legislation, there are going to be unintended consequences and/or problems that come up. So we'll want to monitor those and continue to do that. And those are areas where I think I can actually be a benefit to both sides and out here, because it's something I've worked on professionally and politically in the past. And I think it's important because it's another 40-year bipartisan problem as to how we deal with criminal justice in this country. And I think everybody is starting to figure out there's a better way to do it. And I'd like to be a part of that solution as well.
Before you were elected to the United States House, you were a member of the North Dakota Senate. What's the big difference between working in the federal Congress versus the North Dakota legislature?
Well, in the North Dakota legislature, we don't have staff. We don't have an office. The biggest issue is, and you know this, if you ever wanted to talk to me, you just called me and I'd answer the phone. Now, controlling your calendar and making sure that you are where you need to be, and just the group of talented people you have surrounding you to make sure you succeed is the big difference.
I'll admit
we could get a lot done in North Dakota if we had 4 or 5 really smart staffers that, quite frankly, make me look good on a daily basis.
Good luck getting the taxpayers to approve that. I'll tell you, it was a little weird though calling you and saying, "Hey, Kelly, which one of your people do I contact to set up an interview with you?" That was a little odd because I'm not used to that with you.
Absolutely, and I don't particularly like it either. But I think that's the biggest thing, and that's not just when we got here. It's from the time we got into the campaign.
Sure.
Is making sure that somebody is in charge of your schedule, and for a guy like me, it's even more important because I tend to want to do everything, and you just can't. And it's a lot easier to tell somebody you have a conflict than it is to say yes and have to call them back 2 days later and say, "I'm sorry, but I was wrong. I'm supposed to be halfway across the state that day." So it's really good to have people I trust and have such respect for around me, but it still takes some getting used to not be in charge of your own calendar.
Well, Kelly, I won't use up any more of your time, other than to say maybe you could get your fellow fresh woman, I guess, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, get your new friend to come out to North Dakota and experience life out here a little bit.
Absolutely, I will bring anybody who wants to come to North Dakota out there, and I would like to travel to the other places too. I mean, we need to understand how things are different, why they're different, and I mean, she got elected by her constituency the same way I did.
And I think what's increasingly important, because I don't know, I look at this federal government shutdown. What it makes me think of is all the federal government, all the stuff the federal government does that maybe they shouldn't be doing. I worry that our federal government's gotten so large it's ungovernable, and I would like, as one of your constituents, Kelly, let's try to make room for us to be different. Let New York be New York. Let North Dakota be North Dakota. I think that's the solution to a lot of what's going on. Just make room for ourselves to be different.
Sure, but I also think that I don't know if you could have 2 districts that probably represent this as well. Of one saying one's a producing district, one's a consuming district, and there's a lot of things we do in North Dakota that are important not just to North Dakota but to everywhere across the country. So I think when we get to recognizing that, and I said this in my campaign and I meant it, is we grow the food and produce the energy that the rest of the country and the world uses, and that's an important part of this economy. And and at the same time, we need to recognize that and educate people about what it is we do in North Dakota.
Kelly, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Rob.
That's it for today's Plain Talk Podcast. Thank you, as always, for listening. Remember, you can follow the podcast by, well, of course, subscribing to it. We're available on Spotify now. We're still working on getting up on iTunes and Google, so be patient for that. If you go to sayanythingblog.com, there's a little tab at the top. It says Plain Talk Podcast. The links for where you can subscribe are available there, including the RSS feed, which you can take and plug into a lot of different podcasting apps, like a Pocket Cast, like some of the others. I'm sure you podcasting veterans can figure all that out. We also can follow me on Twitter at Rob Port, or of course Facebook. You can find me on Facebook, Rob Port. You can find sayanythingblog.com on Facebook and Twitter as well. Anyway, thanks once again for listening, and we'll talk again.